So hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Hamlin. For those who don't know me, I'm the co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. We're the only Center for Air and Space Law in the country. I'm also the co-founder and president of For All Moonkind, which is the only organization in the world that is focused on protecting human heritage in outer space. So you think about things like the Apollo Lunar Heritage Sites. And I'm also the president of the National Space Society, which is the only organization in the world that's really focused on sort of civilian space and moving beyond Earth and building communities in space, whether on other celestial bodies or on orbit. So we're going to take the sort of bring the discussion back into a nearer future. We had the fantastic discussion earlier. By the way, I should also just say thank you so much for having me and letting me do this panel because I've been very excited by it. So thank you, Arizona. So we're going to move more into the near future and think about what we're actually doing on the moon right away. So we have to, obviously what we do today is going to feed into how we deal with property. But right now we have some very real issues about how we manage resources on the moon as we get there now. And so I have an incredible panel. I have Martin Elvis, astrophysicist and author from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He is our only scientist, and he is the only one who's allowed to have slides. Chris Johnson is a space law advisor at Skirrow Foundation and teaches space law at Georgetown University, and he will be sort of talking about the law with respect to thinking about how we sustain and manage resources on the moon sustainably and successfully. Mike Gold is the Executive Vice President for Civil Space and External Affairs at Redwire Space. He's also an architect of the Artemis Accords, so all of the questions that were raised in the last session, he can answer. And Robin Dickey is a space policy strategy analyst at the Aerospace Corporation, and she's going to be telling us how we can keep the peace on the moon. So with that, I'm going to just sort of put some thoughts in your head about sort of focusing on the moon and thinking about, Martin's going to tell us, Dr. Ellis tell us about what the resources are. But I just want to put in your head that there are a lot of other things besides just things we want to mine. I would argue that our most precious resource on the moon right now are the artifacts that are there, our history on the moon. And so when we think about utilizing the resources on the moon, when we think about going back to the moon, we need to think about what we've already done on the moon and all of the things we need to save on the moon that we've put there ourselves. We also want to think about whether there are other things on the moon that we want to protect from a conservation standpoint. Is there an environment we want to protect? Is there anything, what does it actually mean? What does stewardship mean? And one other thing, thinking about, we talked a lot about Article 2, there is a big question about what is a celestial body? Should the moon be treated like any other asteroid? Should the moon be treated something differently? The Earth is a celestial body, and yet we own property on Earth. So what are we, how are we going to think about things differently? We heard a lot about the Outer Space Treaty and how we really need to start focusing on filling in those gaps and agreeing to interpretations. And so that's what we're going to try to do today, at least with respect to what it means to manage the resources on the moon with responsible stewardship. So with that, Dr. Elvis, we look forward to hearing what we need to worry about.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Is that good? Okay, as Michelle said, I am not a lawyer. And so forgive me for anything that sounds silly to you, but I'm just trying to bring a little detail, a little specificity to the discussion about resources in space. And I wrote a book about that to give you some creds. It's available on Amazon. I need the slides, not only because I'm an astronomer and the other astronomer in the room there, Richard Green, will agree, we all need to use PowerPoint as a crutch, but also because I think the figures will be, and the maps will be illuminating, right? So I've defined this thing that I call sites of extraordinary scientific importance on the moon as a general term, and I'm going to talk about the case of astronomy from the moon, which for a long time was nothing much, but is now becoming a newly resurgent concept. So this is based on the shocking reaction to astronomers of the Starlink LEO constellation, thousands of satellites. We were completely caught by surprise. It has bad effects on many of our survey telescopes in particular. One that cost about $1 billion is about to start operations in Chile, and it can be quite significantly affected by this and by the many more to come. So we were shocked, and so we're sort of on alert. Where else are we going to be challenged by the need to protect sites for astronomy in space? And so, thanks to Richard Green over there, he inveigled me into writing a good fraction of the response of the American Astronomical Society to this request for information that you're probably familiar with. So, what my response was based on work I did with Alana Krolikovsky, a policy expert now in Missouri, and Tony Milligan in King's College London, who's an ethicist. We found, looking at the moon, that most of the lunar resources are highly concentrated. There are typically a dozen or so sites that are particularly rich in whatever thing you're looking for. They're typically only a few kilometers across. And with many players about to enter, it's a very different situation from the 1967 OST, when it was basically just the Soviet Union and the US that mattered. And so there's going to be problems for governments. And this is quite obvious, and you're all aware of that, but perhaps not of the resources. So let me give 3 examples. Helium-3 is considered a valuable resource, which is available on the moon for fusion reactors that we don't yet have, but never mind, it should be sometime. We should have them sometime. It is not as smoothly distributed as originally thought. Here's a map, and you can see there's a factor of, between the blue and the little red dots, there's a factor of 5 in richness and concentration of helium-3. So if you're a miner, if you're a geophysicist, that might look uniform, I don't know. But to a miner, those little red dots are all you're interested in. You don't go to the poor, weak deposits first. If you look in detail at one of those, RMS Scobiense, you can see there's a little white circle around a little red dot that's really only a few kilometers across, and that is the resolution of this data. It might even be more concentrated than that. You don't know until you go and check. There's another one. There's a couple of hundred openings in the lunar surface that let you see into the interior a little bit. They're probably skylights of lava tubes that can be very large on the moon. And there's 200 of them or more. They're good because they're safe havens against radiation and against micrometeorites, and tend to have a more stable temperature, so it's easier to build a base inside them if you want to keep people alive. However, they're not all equal. Many of them, a few of them have one side that is caved in, as you can see in these pictures, and that means that you can just drive down into them. If it's instead like this, then you have to have some kind of elevator that you can build, some kind of winch to get things up and down. On the other hand, this one on the right has a big overhang, so you know already that there's places where humans can shelter. So you really want both, one side collapsed and the other side going deep into the lava tube that we think to be there. And then thirdly, you want them near the resources. And if you mean by that the water at the South Pole, these are almost all a long way from that. So there's probably only a handful, and I need to work with the guys who did this survey, that are actually win on all 3 counts, and therefore they will be the ones that everybody wants to go to. Very well known are the lunar cold traps, the permanently shadowed regions, north and south poles. The map on the left shows where the temperatures, so maximum temperature during the year, and you want all those purple bits, or the dark blue bits. That's where the temperature is below 110 Kelvin, and that's where water no longer sublimates out, and so it's trapped permanently, meaning several billion years. And you probably all know about this. They retain the volatiles from the early bombardment of the Earth and the Moon system. And there's probably maybe even a billion tons of water trapped in these permanently shadowed regions. That sounds like a lot. It's a cubic kilometer. That's a small lake. It's not actually a huge amount, but it's a heck of a lot more than we thought was there a few years ago. And so it's a major resource for human bases, for making fuel and life support. You all know this. And of course, could create a mining industry on the moon. So those are the 3 examples of general resources that are important. Now we look at astronomy resources. Again, as with other resources, the scientific resources are also highly concentrated. They're capable, the conditions in these locations can make telescopes that make the James Webb telescope look like a toy. But these are in delicate environments that are easily ruined for science. And again, they have a few sites, a few kilometers across, and many players about to enter, and so problems for governments. So let's look at them. The lunar cold traps, great for gravitational wave detectors because of their low seismic activity and their cryogenic nature. The coldest of the cold traps, and those little very purple spots on this map, I pointed to one of them with an arrow there. They're really only a few kilometers across, and there's just a few of them, and that's where you want to put an infrared telescope because the background radiation that it's fighting against is way less there than it is anywhere else. And again, mining is dirty. It lofts dust into the atmosphere, which could coat the mirrors of a telescope. It's noisy. Vibrations create seismic noise, which could make the gravitational wave detector far less sensitive. And so they pose activities like that pose hazards for scientific instruments. Last example, lunar far side is a great place for a cosmology telescope because the Earth background from our radio and TV transmissions is 100 million times less. Also good for SETI searches. But of course, it needs to be it's on the far side because it is shielded from our emissions. But the far side is mostly mountainous. It's not like the near side. And so you need to find a fairly large, smooth region on the far side with slopes less than about 15 degrees, which is about all a rover can manage at the moment. And it needs to be about 200 kilometers across, otherwise you don't get a sharp image in your radio mapping. And so that's a requirement, and that leads to just a few candidate sites that we looked at. And my student, Zoe Lecomte, did this last year, and she looked at the 8 sites in detail, using LiDAR data from LRO to measure the slopes on a fairly large scale. And she found that of the possible sites, 3 were too rough, 2 were too small, and there were and so you're just left with 3 that are plausible sites for this radio cosmology telescope. So we surely need to do something to make sure they're not in some way interfered with in the future. The Gravitational Wave Observatory, I didn't mention the size. It's a 40-kilometer triangle on a side, 40 by 40 by 40 triangle. Needs cryogenic temperatures. If you look at those big enough craters to do that in on the south pole of the moon, where the permanent shadowed regions are, there are 3. And this is a map of the water content of those 3. And you can see that up the 2 to the top left, pretty rich in water. And that's Hayworth and Shoemaker craters. But one, Faustini, is very dry. So that sounds like the place we need to protect. We put a lunar, one of the best places to put a lunar cosmology telescope of 3 sites is Mare Moscoviensis here, and you can see a picture here. That's a 200-kilometer long yellow line, just to show you some scale. This, however, is also one of those prime helium-3 mining sites that I showed you earlier. Like I showed you this little map. It's right in the Mare Moscoviensis. So we can immediately see there will be conflicts or possibilities of conflicts, as in the use of the craters and so on. So we need to prepare. This is not this in general may sound a little abstract, although I think it's coming pretty fast. But there's actually a right now issue in the far side, because there's this Chinese relay satellite Chiao. That's the best I can do, I'm sorry. That is on the far side at it's a radio relay for the Chang'e 4 far side rover. It's in an L2 orbit, which means it's permanently hanging over the far side of the moon and directing its signal back towards Earth, and undoubtedly spilling sun all over the backside of the moon. It's not the Chinese that are at fault. This is a perfectly sensible thing for them to be doing. And there are other proposals like the Lunar Geophysical Network, which will put seismometers all around the moon, which will require the same kind of data relay. So we have some issues there. So that leads us to say, well, how can we mitigate these problems? There are things you can do technically. You can investigate suppression of side lobes, harmonics, electronics, noise on the surface in orbit. You're going to find be sure you found the driest of the permanently shadowed region, so it's not interesting to miners, and you'll keep your infrared telescope or gravitational wave telescope safe. There could be ways to minimize dust wafting when you're landing heavy landers on the moon. That's going to kick up an enormous amount of dust, scaling from Apollo anyway. And we need to minimize vibration from any traffic that's going around or any mining activities, or maybe, and from launches, sorry. But the problem is, why should we invest in this if the other people are going to violate it? And so we need incentives that everyone will want to do this and apply these techniques once they've been developed. Now, for instance, the Far-Side Cosmology Telescope is probably a many billion-dollar project. Maybe you just get everyone to sign on to it, all space powers, and each have a part, and then everyone has the incentive for that at least. And you may want to do it one by one. But basically, it's a challenge for policy. Astronomers might say, well, let's just not do anything on the moon that isn't science. Good luck with that. Also, we need, so the reason astronomers are getting interested in it, again, is because of the human spaceflight infrastructure that will be built, which will enable us to do these telescopes. So we can't have one without the other. So it's a matter of setting standards, which I've already talked about. So all you guys are the experts in this kind of thing. How do we set up a regime where we have carrots and sticks that bring people to gradually accept these mitigation effects? In the Artemis Accords, I noted, my best to imitate a lawyer, has a phrase about some kind of optimizing of scientific long-term value, and you could reinterpret that phrase and expand it into something that would protect this kind of work. So astronomy is just one example. I am not familiar with even lunar science and the other possibilities. I'm sure there are several others. I'm working on contacting those people, but if you have contacts, let me know. And we all need to get this into one database of the places we really want to protect, and then it's something specific to hand over to policymakers and lawyers. So that's what I would say, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. I think you did a really great job showing us all of the conflicts and competitions we're going to have on the moon. And it's astronomy, science, heritage, mining of resources, possibly tourism, and the competing interests aren't just national, they're also going to be private interests as well. And so to sort of sketch out the legal framework of what we're looking at right now, Chris is going to walk us through what the Outer Space Treaty says. Thank you.
Hi there, and good morning, everyone. First, to reintroduce myself, my name is Chris Johnson. I'm a space law advisor at Secure World Foundation. It's a private NGO focused on peaceful uses of outer space, space sustainability, preventing conflict in outer space. And traditionally, when we first started, we were looking at space debris, radio frequency interference, low Earth orbit, geosynchronous type stuff. So why from an NGO am I thinking about lunar activities? And the answer to that is we are really now in an era of norm making and norm formation for the moon. And in fact, now space law traditionally, which has applied and mostly thinking about void space, how do we use orbits? How are frequencies used? We're now dealing with a place that you can go to where you can stay, where there's resources to use. And we realize that the rules that we're creating for the moon, these are going to be the very important rules that go elsewhere to other celestial bodies, asteroids, Mars, etc. So we are now in a different era of rulemaking and thinking about how space law will evolve, because space law, as it has existed for decades, is quite a generalized regime. As you read the Outer Space Treaty on Principles, you see that it applies to all of these celestial bodies in a mostly homogeneous fashion, which seems strange because we're dealing with everything from inner rocky body planets to gas giants to asteroids to the sun. All of it applies in a very homogeneous fashion, what we're going to have is kind of a fracturing or a specialization for just moon law, just lunar law. And in fact, when we read through the treaties, we do see that there's some elements of the treaties that are specific to the moon. And what I always point to is Article 4, Paragraph 2, says the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. And that, the list here, military bases, installations, fortifications are prohibited. Weapons testing and military maneuvers are prohibited. So the moon has a special regime. I don't know what exclusively peaceful purposes means, but I know that it means something beyond peaceful purposes. And that language was put in there intentionally. And then that second sentence with all of those prohibitions, with some slight carve-outs in sentences 3 and 4. So we wanted to have a even heightened, specialized, peaceful regime that we have for the moon in Article 4, Paragraph 2. Elsewhere in the Outer Space Treaty, we have the right of reciprocal visitations, which we find in Article 12 of the Outer Space Treaty. And as you read through the treaty, yes, it says, outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So we really are starting to think through which of these articles and which of these principles apply in principle and which are specific to the moon. And as we heard from our last panel, when you start to really try and find what the exact answer is, huge differences in opinion. And why is that? Because we're dealing with just a generalized set of rules. And so what is interesting now, and where we're moving now, is that now we're going to be drawing from other areas of international law, including, for example, international environmental law with its precautionary principle, international, law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, see what principles there apply also to the moon, and a whole host of, you can look to everything, I would say, from, construction law, mining law, human rights, all of these things apply in principle because they're international law and states are the subjects of international law, but because of Article 6, states are also responsible, meaning answerable for the activities of non-governmental actors. And we're seeing how these other areas of international law will apply in, specifically to specific scenarios that we have on the moon. So we have this great era of international lawmaking, which will be lunar lawmaking. And I think that, years from now, there'll be space lawyers, there's frequency lawyers, there'll be just moon lawyers. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about, you wanted me to talk about how, how we'll do this in a peaceful and sustainable fashion. I know Robin will get to that as well, but allow me to put on the hat. I work at an NGO, a peace, kind of a hippie, imagine me with corduroy pants and a goatee. I work at an NGO which represents civil society, okay? And when we look at Article 1, the exploration and use of outer space shall be the province of all humankind, not the province of states, not the province of corporations, which are very well represented and have their views are first at the table in these discussions, but it is the right to explore outer space and use outer space, which is owned, which is a right owned and held by the peoples of the world. And while outer space does not belong to us, the right to explore and use it belongs to us. And that means that the views of civil society, the views of people who benefit from space, the views of the scientific community, the views of the academic community, their views, in fact, under Article 1, take primacy over those views of states which have their national interests and those views of corporations which are looking at shareholder profit. So I have to stress that when we are applying new economic models to space, when we're looking at space and the moon as a place which is I don't want to call it a global commons publicly, but a place which is rivalrous and excludable and has all these challenges and is 238,000 miles from the nearest courthouse or the Security Council, a place which is, when you're there, you're operating in 1/6 gravity, where the soil is, ground glass and will, destroy your materials, a place where it's a challenge just to keep you alive. We have to be setting up economic rules and principles which are not merely exploitative, monopolistic, first come, first serve, and lead to those types of dystopian scenarios that we can imagine where might makes right. So this is the challenge that we have. as civil society, as people who are interested in the moon, your views matter. And this is the challenge that we have for the ensuing decades, or the opportunity. Thank you.
Here, the moon and the space belongs to all of us, right? It's really time to start thinking about it that way. And I really appreciate your comments to that effect. I was surprised. Before I hand off to Mike, I want to talk a little bit about the due regard provision. And so we talked a lot about Article 2 and can you own property, Article 4, the non-militarization of space, whether that applies to private entities or not. But we do also have one other sort of restriction on activities in space given to us in the Outer Space Treaty, and that's Article 9, which says that activities in space will be conducted with due regard to the activities of others. And I bring that up because it's really, when we think about, Chris started talking about how everyone has access to everybody else's bases and so forth and other celestial bodies. How do we keep things private? And is that where due regard comes in? How do we interpret due regard? Talk about two simple words that will have lawyers talking for decades and fighting in court for decades unless we figure out how to interpret it. That's really a large part of our challenge as well. And I know the Artemis Accords actually take due regard into consideration quite a bit. And so with that, I will hand it off to Mike.
I'm sure my grandchildren's college will be paid for on due regard. It's a gift that keeps on giving. As was said, my name is Michael, Executive Vice President for Civil Space at Redwire Space. I consider myself a recovering attorney. I don't know if that's enough to get me slides, but we'll see. Not this time, no. And I'd like to thank the University of Arizona for hosting us. We're actually partners with Redwire on the Orbital Reef program. Redwire is the only company to successfully manufacture items on the International Space Station. Relative to the moon, we've actually got a payload on the ISS now that's looking at taking simulated regolith, both lunar regolith and Martian regolith, and seeing what we can build out of it. We are working on the LVSAT program with vertical solar arrays, and our solar arrays are powering the International Space Station right now. They're roll-out solar arrays, sort of like a carpet and roll out. Terrific technology for the moon because it deals with the dust issue, that if you can retract your arrays and then deploy them, it definitely helps with dust. And anyway, happy to be partnered there. And if we have any heritage that we preserve from the moon, I'd like to thank Michelle for all of her amazing work that she's done with For All Moonkind there. So much to talk about and where to even start. I do just want to take a little bit of issue as we say that corporations are first at the table relative to these discussions, because I see it as quite the opposite, that corporations, unfortunately, I think are at a significant disadvantage because the international system, and to an extent the domestic system of policy and law, was not set up to accommodate today's reality of robust commercial space participation. And that's the challenge that we've all got as a legal community, to somehow ensure that the system that was just for states evolves to be able to accommodate critical private sector feedback and thoughts. Because again, the private sector is the one that's going to be enabling all of this. So as we just heard with Starlink, for example, it's very important that we be at the table, and the system was not established for that. So your FACAs, your Federal Advisory Committees, NGOs like For All Moonkind, the Global Experts Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities, groups like COSPAR are going to be so important. I haven't heard COSPAR mentioned today, but if we're going to talk about preserving the moon, here, let's make some headlines for Jeff. So I've been appointed as the first representative of the Committee on Industry Relations to the COSPAR Planetary Protection Panel. And I think that's a really important step. Now, companies have been providing feedback previously, informally, as part of the PPP, but this is a great direction and path to go in, where we're all working together. Beware of false dichotomies. The question should never be private sector or government or science or commercial or science, human spaceflight, human robotics. The answer is always both. That, as the professor pointed out, you see human spaceflight enabling a lot of the astronomy. So we always need to find ways to work together, to be stronger together. And that is very much what the Artemis Accords are about. So I appreciate going after Chris, because he describes the Outer Space Treaty. And in many ways, the Artemis Accords are implementing the Outer Space Treaty. The challenge that we've got with the outer space treaty, and I love me some outer space treaty, right? Like over 50 years old doesn't look a day over 35. I really think it was a truly brilliant crafting exercise, and the people who developed it had great foresight. And the idea that it's principles, so high-level principles, is why it's been able to last so long, because the objectives and goals of the outer space treaty are as relevant today as they were back in the 60s in terms of peace and preserving the environment and science, et cetera. However, what you can't do with the outer space treaty is say, here, Kathy, or here, Jim, do this. You needed to go down at least one level to take the objectives of the outer space treaty and say, how is it that we will implement these worthy goals and objectives? To give an example of that are the safety zones in the Artemis Accords. So the outer space treaty says, avoid harmful interference, right? We all want to avoid harmful interference, especially on the football field where you get called for it. That's one discussion. How do we do that? And as we were drafting the Artemis Accords, the process that we came up with, which has been discussed in many areas, including the Gangslaw, that Chris, I think, in at least your world was a big part of, was the concept of safety zones. And to be clear, and let me try and tackle as many of the questions that I think you were probably asking about the Accords as I can. Safety zones are not stay-out zones. It drives me nuts as I hear this, that they are not exclusionary zones. The concept of the safety zone is actually an obligation on the country that is operating in an area to be transparent, to let the United Nations know where they are and generally what they're doing, and then to coordinate with any entity that comes into that area so that we can ensure peaceful activities and avoid what? Harmful interference. If there's a better way to avoid harmful interference, I haven't heard it yet, but would love to. And what's so important there too, which is another misperception, is that obviously it's not an exclusionary zone because the text of the Accords themselves anticipate two entities operating in the same area per the requirements of Article 1. But what do they have to do? You have to be transparent and you have to work with each other to avoid harming each other. And also, as we talk about the extent of the zone, this is another misperception that come up. Well, what if a country declares a really large safety zone? Well, the language of the Accords states that you look at the area where you could potentially cause harmful interference. That's the metric that you want to know how far, if something off-nominal happens, you could cause damage. That's the area that you've got, not even so much advantages, but obligations relative to, again, informing and coordinating. So that's just one example of how the Accords take a goal of the Outer Space Treaty and implement it to preserve the peace and to prevent conflict. Additionally, another misperception that can occur with the Accords, which has been particularly pernicious despite the number of times I talk on panels like these, is space resources. The Accords is a document that was meant to unify humanity, not to divide, that we were looking for common ground amongst countries that in some cases held differing views. For example, you have the United States, and it's our policy currently that we are opposed to the Moon Treaty. Then you have a country like France or Mexico, who actually, and Australia, that are signatories to the Moon Treaty. So with the Accords, we were looking for what's the common ground? What can we all agree to? And when it came to space resources, we thought that we could all agree that you can extract, you can utilize resources, do so in a fashion that's safe and sustainable and in full compliance with Article 2. Now, that doesn't solve future policy issues per se, but it is a modest step forward, establishing common ground that we can all agree to, because that's an important step to keep the peace and to prevent conflict and to preserve the environment so that we can do both human spaceflight, resources, and science. And as the corporate representative, of course, I'm going to say this too, but I'm a huge science fiction fan in my personal life. It's like a big Star Trek fan, right? Where are my Star Trek fans out there? Right? And well, Star Trek, I think, has done a tremendous amount of good in the industry and in the real world. a science fiction movie that I think has done a great deal of damage, particularly in our field, is Avatar. That there's this concept of this unobtainium, and that these evil corporations are going to get phenomenally wealthy off of mining what? And we talk about helium-3. I only wish there was this incredibly robust business case for helium-3. Everything that I've heard from the scientific community is that we are a very, very, very long way away from this, if ever, of being able to economically utilize helium-3. So what are we really talking about when it comes to space resources, particularly in the near and mid-term? We're talking about scientific investigations, explorations by space agencies. These are, being done for the good of humanity, to develop data, to develop science. As we looked at the Artemis Accords, for the first word in Artemis Accords, it's the Artemis program, that we wanted to make sure that as we and our international partners conduct the Artemis program, that we do so in a manner that supports our global international obligations for the agreements that we have now, for the Outer Space Treaty, for the agreement on the rescue of astronauts, the registration convention. Let's take the rules that are on the books and make sure that we're actually implementing them, along with a couple of other common sense concepts, which I hope we can all agree on, such as the full, free, and fair open release of scientific data. And we should be taking the whole world with us on this amazing journey that's Artemis. Interoperability, something that only makes sense. If we want to have a international peaceful world, and even for commercial activities, the more that we can have interoperable systems, the better. So as we look at what the future could and would be, the Accords were designed as a first step to preserve peace, to encourage international cooperation. And another frequent question to get relative to the Accords as well, China and Russia haven't signed. Again, look at the first word of the Accords. It's Artemis Accords. This is the Artemis program. And again, the purpose is for the countries that are participating in Artemis to take our best foot forward and again, demonstrate how we are going to support a peaceful, transparent, beneficial future in space that implements the international treaties. Now, we do certainly hope that countries like China and Russia are influenced by the Accords. We're attorneys, we love precedent, right? So even for countries that haven't signed, there's influence that the Accords create in terms of this is how responsible space actors should be. But in terms of signing, if you're not part of the Artemis program, you're not necessarily obligated. That being said, I hope every country in the world, and if there are any countries beyond the world, I'll sign the Artemis Accords to support the common sense principles. Because as we develop the Accords, we had, by the way, a real combination of traditional partners and new entrants, such as United Arab Emirates, such as Australia, Luxembourg, and now you've got over 21 countries in the Accords. And while I'm very excited about the traditional partners, particularly France signing on recently, but I'm at least equally as excited for some of the smaller nations, the Mexicos of the world, Colombias, that haven't been a part of space previously. And this demonstrates that through the Accords, and that was the idea, that the vehicle is to create the largest, broadest, most diverse human spaceflight coalition in history, and bringing this diversity, because I believe diversity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the most beneficial thing to do for mission success. And as we get these new peoples, new cultures, new ideas infused into the space field, we're all going to benefit from it. And that's what the Accords are. I'm sure there are many other questions. But let me just say, getting back to science fiction with the Accords, I hope that we have a future that is much closer to Star Trek and much less like Star Wars. Stop there and let me answer your questions.
Thank you, Mike. I think I'm a fan of the Artemis Accords, so I won't be your cheerleader today. I think we know that already. But I am going to ask Robin to sort of address the elephant in the room here, and that's China. So we know in the news that China and the United States are actually looking to go back to the same area of the South Pole. in missions. I don't think they're exactly defined where they're going to go, but there's a potential that there could be some conflict in terms of those sites. In addition to just sort of simply having the site on the moon, we do worry also about the plume effect. We know that our very first archaeological return from the moon was Surveyor 3, and we know that Surveyor 3 was actually pitted from 300 feet away from the landing of the Apollo 12 lunar module. So it's not just sort of, notice that I'm here, it's notice that I'm here, and that if you get too close, you're going to ruin my equipment. And so there is really a lot of potential for sort of conflict on the moon, even if we're not that close to each other. And so with that, Robin, I throw it over to you.
Thank you. So to reintroduce myself briefly, my name is Robin Dickey. I'm a space policy analyst at the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. So I am neither a lawyer nor an astronomer, so they didn't even let me bring my shadow puppets, let alone a PowerPoint. But the joy of going last is I get to stand a bit on the shoulders of what some of my fellow panelists have said up to this point. To set the stage a little bit initially, my focus in a lot of my research and policy efforts is on norms of responsible behavior for space. And one fun thing about norms is that there is no norm for the definition of norm. I like to use the definition that a norm is a generally agreed upon standard for what kinds of behavior are acceptable or unacceptable. So that's a pretty broad definition, and it encompasses things like law, especially if a law is established and all of the countries are actively applying it, interpreting it, and responding when someone violates the law in other countries' eyes. But it can also mean non-binding guidelines that are generally agreed upon across the international community. It can be even as simple as series of declaratory statements by different countries, different companies, different actors saying, I see this is acceptable behavior, this is unacceptable behavior. So that's my broad focus. And there are lots of different applications for norms of behavior. But from the focus of preventing security and conflict, there are a couple very specific benefits that you can generate with norms. First of all, you can establish common agreements that allow you to resolve misunderstandings and confusion or misinterpretation of different behaviors. You can also set common responses or understandings of what will happen if someone violates those common behaviors. And so to foot stomp a couple of things that my panelists brought up earlier, one thing that I want to point out is the recognition that there are so many different perspectives, understandings, and values when it comes to the moon. Countries have different values based off of capabilities, interests on the moon. Companies have their own sets of perspectives. Individuals, citizens have different perspectives on the moon. Indigenous communities ascribe significant values to the moon. So there's so many different perspectives that you have to deal with. Taking that one step further, there are also an equally diverse range of perspectives on what would constitute a threat to those interests and values. And a step further from that, there are different perspectives on what an actor would do in response to perceived threats against their values and interests in the moon. So all this to say that, in my opinion, international relations and policy can be much more difficult than rocket science because people are involved and people are complicated, and it's very hard to interpret or find a solution. And so how do you do that with norms of behavior for space? I recently published a paper. I like to use puns in my paper titles. So normentum is the word I like to use to describe the process of developing and generating that commitment to norms. This recent paper focused on the intersection of commercial space actors, security challenges and perceptions of threat, and norms of behavior for space. And for this conversation, I want to focus on one of the three categories of threats that I looked at. So the three categories that I looked at are collateral damage. So whenever there is conflict, even just between military actors, especially given the physics of space, there is risk of collateral damage from debris, from radio frequency interference that can affect a lot more than whoever is directly engaged in a challenge or a conflict or a crisis. The third of the categories, I'm focusing on the second one, so I'll do it out of order, The third category is direct threats. It's important to know that in human history, threats are not just made between militaries. In many conflicts, there have been attacks on, for example, commercial maritime shipping. Whether or not it's directly involved in a conflict, there can be perceptions of a value to that attack, and then challenges with how you mitigate and respond to those threats. So all of those are issues, but what I want to focus on today is the risk of misperception, miscalculation, and inadvertent escalation, or something that doesn't necessarily start as an intentional punch in the face on the moon could escalate and become a much more serious crisis or conflict than any of the parties initially intended. When it comes to space and the moon, there are so many novel activities, novel technologies, that it's really hard to develop a policy perspective sometimes. So I like to use analogies and comparisons to examples of similar challenges on Earth. And one that I looked at for this inadvertent escalation challenge was attacks on commercial aircraft. I looked at 11 different cases in which countries shot down commercial airliners, which is a pretty easy norm or concept to recognize, that like, don't shoot down commercial airliners that are just filled with civilians. But there were enough cases where, given issues of sovereign territory, airspace, context in which there were tensions between different countries, that an approaching aircraft, which maybe was off course because of navigational challenges, could have been misidentified, or that their erratic behavior was interpreted as a threat. And if there were communication challenges between that aircraft and the country considering it a threat, it might not be able to be resolved in time, which in many of these cases resulted in tragedy. So how do you prevent such tragedies from happening as these incredibly diverse actors do more and more activities on the moon in the way that Michelle already indicated can affect each other, even if you're not in immediate proximity at all times? And so a couple points that I've carried over for potential norms, I sort into kind of three categories. If you're going to resolve a crisis, first you need to have the mechanisms for the right people to talk to each other, to be in the same room, on the same phone call, etc. And that it can already be a technical challenge. First of all, both sides have to recognize there's an issue that they have to resolve and know to pick up the phone and have the technical means to get in conversation. Second of all, how do you get the sides to agree on the facts of the situation and understand each other? One of my favorite references that I like to point out is that in many languages, one word is used for the terms safety and security, which can be really challenging when you're interpreting different behaviors. And so it's not just linguistic barriers, it's also operational definitions. If you have an operator talking to a politician, they might not be able to understand each other, even if they speak the same language. And then the final challenge is, how do you actually get that common agreement on what you want to do, how to resolve the issue and move forward? And that is equally, if not more challenging than the other two questions. And so norms of behavior is one way to try to pick apart each of these three categories, establishing lines of communication and points of contact so that you have someone that you know you can call if there's an issue to resolve. Establishing, when appropriate, common definitions that you can point to make sure you are talking about the same thing. And then finally, deliberative processes in which different actors identify behaviors and publicly explain that these are the things that we find threatening. This is what we might do in response to perceiving that threat, so that others can know if there might be an issue and avoid it more easily ahead of time. And so with that summary, I think I'll be ready to answer any other questions, but that's the nutshell of norms for the minute.
Thank you. I love it. We need a red hotline for the moon, right? To communicate with each other. So now I'll open the floor to questions, but I will take the moderator's prerogative. Chris, you talked about, all of us, everyone talked about norms, but you talked about how the moon is something separate. But you also noted that what we do on the moon is going to guide everything else we do in space. Like, how do you see that separation happening? Because personally, I think the moon deserves a lot more protection than some asteroid we've never seen before. But how are we going to draw that line and show sort of the moon? And maybe you don't think the moon is something special. I don't know. But you talked about lunar lawyers. Are we going to also have asteroid lawyers?
Yeah, interesting question. All right, so I talked a little bit about this. You know, I like when people talk about the moon as the eighth continent. Isn't that phrase? The moon's the eighth continent? Because it's the only place that no matter where you are on Earth, you can go outside and look at it. I can't go outside and look at Afghanistan or Antarctica. Anywhere on Earth, you can see the moon. So it's already part of our kind of sphere of what we are thinking about as a place that is part of our life. We can imagine it, we can picture it. And as I said, we have space law that has talked about all, orbits and frequencies in low Earth orbit and, appropriation or, allocation of slots. But now we're talking about a location, a destination that we can develop where all those other concepts from international law and national law will start applying. You could go down a whole list of, corporate law, construction law, environmental law, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're going to be applying because there potentially could be all this different types of activity in different, variety of actors and a variety of actions that are taking place, whether it's scientific, whether it's commercial, or I don't want to be binary and say that these things are, in categories, but a whole mix of issues. I mean, that's the only response that I have. If you want more.
No, thank you. I really find it fascinating because I agree. The moon is something special. Robin alluded to it. There are cultural reasons that we look at the moon differently from how we would look at a piece of rock that nobody's seen that's out in the asteroid belt. I wanted to ask also, Martin. You talked about science and exploration, and I brought in commerce. One of the things that concerns me about the moon are what I've learned in terms of vanity trips, right? Just send your stuff to the moon and it'll stay there forever because it's the moon. And the moon doesn't have any kind of status, but we certainly would not promote, hey, send your stuff to Yellowstone and just throw it in Old Faithful. And so how, I don't know, Martin, have you thought about that and what that would mean in terms of private? I mean, we talked about the spaces for everyone. So as an individual, I should have the right to throw my block into whatever crater you want to put your telescope in.
Well, clearly, the whole point I was saying is we need to start being specific about particular sites. And so we're going to have to, if you have a base on the South Pole, you're going to have some place where you put the trash. And you've got to agree that that's not got any value to anybody otherwise, because there will be trash. Also, I agree, the moon is different from an random old asteroid, which are millions out in the main belt. So I worry that there's the thing that I call the founder effect that Wilbur Zielinski talked about, where the first people to do something, set up some way of behaving, laws, just customs or whatever, and that can be far more influential for generations to come than thousands and thousands of people later on. And so if we set up a more restrictive regime for the moon, we've got to be careful we don't just automatically roll that forward to the asteroids, because that could be too restrictive.
Hot pursuit. If we're thinking about ways to spur economic activity on the moon and, what can commercial actors do on the moon, we have to also not just imagine, well, can this make money? Can this be profitable? But we have to think about those long-term precedent-setting consequences and the idea that if we permit it, we can't really object if other actors in the international system do the same thing. So if we want to do a couple things on the moon, like, inter human remains or cremated pet remains on the moon, which are business plans, if that's your best idea for developing lunar activity, if that's your best idea, then I've not a good idea of the future of commercial spaceflight and lunar development. We have to think through the consequences of it, and the idea that we're not going to be able to object if any other country does anything that they can imagine on the moon. Well, they can always point to us and say, well, you permitted that.
Although to take the converse of that, right, that again, going back to the principles of the Accords, many of them were developed in response to, just to be candid, what we haven't seen China do. Transparency is key, that we want transparent activities on the moon. I would say the US is a paragon of transparency, almost too much, where you see the sausage making being made on C-SPAN and what NASA's doing and FOIA. We don't have that with the Chinese. And again, we talked about COSPAR and preserving the environment for science. I would maybe take a little bit of issue with saying that the moon is special. I think there are special areas on the moon, and we need to look at celestial bodies holistically, which again is why the COSPAR is important. It's important that the COSPAR get its regulations right and that we implement those regulations practically, because they're going to be areas that are of heightened scientific interest. Probably most relevant to a lot of Michelle's work, the COSPAR actually protects the human landing sites, not because of the cultural or historic heritage, but because of potential scientific heritage. So I think it's important that we establish these sorts of principles, not just for the moon, but they're also very applicable for Mars, or even if there was an asteroid that potentially harbored life. So again, I just encourage a holistic view of the value of certain areas. And at the same time, again, we need to be very cautious not to hinder innovation or development, because it actually benefits science and can benefit all of humanity. And let's just be modest for a moment here. And I steal this frequently from the former NASA administrator. It was not that long ago that we thought the moon was bone dry. Bone dry. Now we're talking about these potentially massive amounts of water ice. And I have no doubt that as we move forward, even just with the CLIPS program, that we are going to have awe-inspiring discoveries on the moon that will redefine what we think of the moon and space exploration generally, which is why when it comes to the Outer Space Treaty or the Artemis Accords, I think it's so important to have flexible governance, because we have yet to unlock many of the moon's greatest secrets.
So thank you, because I think that's really important also when we think about laws and regulations for human communities that are not on Earth. I don't think there's anybody in this room who has experienced not being on Earth. And so how can we actually provide a framework for that experience if we haven't experienced ourselves? So that's my pitch to get sent to ISS. Anyway, question.
Love the pitch. I would take that e-ticket in a heartbeat.
Closer to your.
Yeah, I will hold it up closer. Thank you. I have one observation. I'm from Colorado, spent the majority of my life there. And so with mine tailings, I'm very much an advocate for appropriate use and long-term thinking when we start to do things on the moon. I wanted to go back to a point Chris made with the lack of authority or ability to militarize, specifically having bases on the moon. Given that prohibition, have we thought about how we do the guarantee of peaceful uses? And so I'd like the panelists' thoughts on how do we project that ability to enforce laws or policies or rules of engagement?
I mean, that's a tough question. It's, the rationale behind it, the reason that, say Space Force thinks that they are permitted to go to the moon is they say, well, if you're going to have activities on the moon, if you're going to have mining and property rights and commercial activity, and you're going to set up safety zones, how are you going to enforce that against bad actors? You're going to need the police there. You need the military there. My response to that is, the U.S. doesn't have that right. We exclusively, put Article 4, Paragraph 2 to non-militarize the moon. So you're going to have to come up with different ways. And this is the challenge. Just like, we don't really know how we can use resources on the moon, but not do national appropriation. We're going to have to look at how we can do coordination and cooperation and prevent escalation, but not land troops with guns there. Guess what? You're going to have to go through diplomatic channels. You're going to have to invoke Article 9 consultations because of potentially harmful interference. You're going to have to look at all the other peaceful settlement of disputes that exist in international law besides the military options, because Article 4, Paragraph 2, and the UN Charter, the threat or use of force is prohibited.
I think we're literally and metaphorically jumping the gun on that one. That let me quote the great G.I. Joe: "Knowing is half the battle. The other half is red and blue lasers," for the record. I think one of the most important things that Space Force and the U.S. military can do, and militaries around the world, is provide SSA, space situational awareness and data that we need to know what is happening on the moon and what is happening in cislunar space generally. Because if we have that information, then you can know whether a safety zone is being violated or whether there's an activity that violates COSPAR regs. If we don't know and don't have transparency and don't have eyes in this arena, then we can't do anything about it. And I think long before we get to troops or force, again, there is the Outer Space Treaty and ultimately how we resolve every conflict on Earth in the end, which is talking to each other. But if we don't have the data and don't know what's occurring, we can't react. And that's why, again, and I'm sorry to be a broken record on this, transparency is key, both in terms of commitment nationally to transparency and for countries that aren't transparent, such as what we've seen with a lot of Chinese activities, our ability to ensure that the US and partner nations have knowledge of what is occurring in space so that we can act accordingly.
But excuse me, it might not be sensible to give or effective to give that responsibility to military organizations because they are not famous for transparency and they're not necessarily trusted by other players. You trust our military, I trust our military, but other countries will not.
And that's where I think it's always important that the answer is both, that this is not just a duty or a responsibility of the military, and this is what's been so wonderful about the second golden age of commercial space, it's public-private partnerships. That we've seen Space Force, NASA reaching out to the private sector to encourage the development of this data that would then be purchased potentially by NASA for scientific purposes in many ways, Department of Commerce to help with space traffic management, or the military. So I completely agree that it needs to be a combination of different organizations and different entities that provide that data so that everyone can be confident and secure in the information that's being presented.
And if I can build off that quickly, a colleague of mine recently did a paper on looking at how international space situational awareness information sharing can be really important to maintaining compliance in an international system for not just international laws, but for norms as well. It doesn't have to be legally binding. The core issue at stake is the notion of trusted information. And so if you're a US actor, that perhaps the US government is sufficient to provide trusted information. But if you're looking internationally and you need a much wider range of countries, companies, and international actors, how do you build an international framework in which data is shared, corroborated, verified? That can help build at least a bigger common picture that not just exists and is viewable, but is trusted. And that will be a significant step towards actually seeing responses to behaviors that countries agree or companies or other actors agree are irresponsible or challenging. And if I can give one more example of different ways that not just enforcement, but empowerment of actors to resolve disputes amongst themselves, going back to that shoot down of a commercial aircraft example, one of the mitigation options that was developed after the shoot down of KAL 007 in the early 1980s was the much wider proliferation of GPS signals to help commercial airline operators understand where they are and where they're going so that they don't at least accidentally veer into sensitive areas. So, I mean, that was specifically a space technology, albeit a geocentric one, so you need something different for the moon, but different technologies that can help actors stop issues before they start, because enforcement is an after the fact issue. And hopefully you can resolve things earlier in that process of escalation.
Robust and comprehensive cislunar SSA will be the foundation for a peaceful future on the moon and in space.
Hi, my name is Andrew Rubin. I'm committee counsel with the House Science, Space and Technology Committee. Just want to say, I disagree with Mike on Avatar. I'm very excited for Avatar 2. Long overdue. But on a different note, sovereign states engaged in commercial activity, under domestic law and international law, and under and it's a recognized norm, do not similarly enjoy sovereign protections, all sovereign protection. But is there a norm for sovereigns engaged in scientific activities recognized in space, or just terrestrial? And is this a state action widely recognized?
I can think of one. I mean, planetary defense. Let's look at, information sharing that is, funded by governments and observatories on the ground and in space share that data with, not because they're required to do so, as some source in international law which requires them to do so, but because they know that it's in their best interest and everyone's best interest, and that's the norm in the scientific community. It is an expected standard of behavior. If you find something interesting in space, to share it with other actors.
So I'll skip the Avatar fight because I can take up the rest of the panel. Found it a little derivative, enjoyed the special effects, but we too love the CGI. If I understand the question correctly, in terms of when we share scientific data internationally, if you look at, again, COSPAR, so when you're conducting a mission to the moon or Mars, you are required to conduct a briefing in an international forum, be it the United Nations or some other appropriate venue, where you say, this is what we're doing to preserve planetary protection, which is different than planetary defense. And I've always hated the name. Planetary protection means you're protecting against harmful forward and backward biological contamination. So that's an example of where we'll share it. Now, not every country is doing that. And that's a problem, and where the US and other partner nations, certainly in the Accords, have led with that transparency. And it's a great concern that if we're not all as a globe supporting planetary protection, then it's going to result in no planetary protection. And this is where the positive precedent is with the US to move forward. Similarly, with the Artemis Accords, we have the political commitment of the 21 nations to proactively, in a free, full, open fashion, share all of the scientific data from the Artemis missions. And while unfortunately we won't be able to take everyone personally to the moon on the Artemis program, the ability that that information is put online for the world to share means no matter who you are or where you are in the world, you can be part of that journey. And that's one of the aspects of the Artemis program that I'm so excited by.
I'll just say in astronomy, we have an example with that we've been making our data much more open and accessible to everybody. And it turns out that's incredibly scientifically productive, because every observation that, for instance, the Chandra X-ray Observatory makes, which I know of the case of, every individual observation is published by the people who applied for time and got it, and that's great. But then over the course of several years, it's 80% of the observations are used 5 times or more. So the published results, more and more and more comes out by making them public. So scientifically, it's a win, a big win.
Frans van der Link. No. Can you hear me now?
Yes, okay, thank you. I have a question, Frans van der Link. I have a question to Chris, because you made a big pitch for high standards for exclusively peaceful purposes. I still think, and I want to be a little bit the devil's advocate here, I have a tie with sharks for a reason. You kind of put the standard pretty high. How do you square that with the fact that Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty, for example, allows the UN Charter to apply to outer space? On Earth, it is actually not, maybe not phrased that way, but at least conceived that part of peaceful is the right of self-defense and the right of use of force if sanctioned by the UN Security Council. Think about Iraq or Afghanistan back in the days. Do you think that would trump, maybe that's not the right word, but that would supersede in any given case the prohibition of exclusively peaceful purposes, or do you think that that even excludes the use of these provisions under the UN Charter in a given situation on the moon?
That's a very difficult question. I think some of my answer would be about the specialness, and space law is a special regime. And if there's special rules for specific activity, that takes primacy. That's a known principle of international law, lex specialis. Therefore, Article 4, Paragraph 2 is central to whatever else, and then including general principles of international law. But dealing with that right of self-defense, what triggers the right of self-defense? If another state has attacked your territory or political integrity, it's very difficult for me to imagine how the right of self-defense could be triggered by the moon, by your activities on the moon, because it's not a place where your territorial integrity could be violated, or the existence of your state could be threatened by any lunar activity. I think that this is different from if you put critical infrastructure in low Earth orbit and that is attacked, and that critical infrastructure, hitting that could trigger the right of self-defense. But the moon, I'd have to say no. That's a preliminary answer, though.
Oh, lots of questions. Okay, please go ahead.
Go ahead with the mic.
Yeah, we'll take it.
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Should we point to somebody else? Yeah.
Hi, Ashley Vanderlei, the National Science Foundation. This is just a quick question for Dr. Elvis. You mentioned a few of the places that were rich in resources, and I was curious, how deep has the surveying gone? Is this just the resources that are easily accessible, or is it possible that there's many more and we've only gone to a certain depth in the surveying?
Yes. So the current surveys, most of the maps have been made at resolutions of a few kilometers, and some of them, and the water measurements using neutron absorption are at worse resolution. So there's a long way to go, and of course there are many attempts to measure the water content coming up in the next few years at a much finer scale. But certainly, if you go to a finer scale, you might find something that seemed to be just an overabundance of a factor of 2 is actually very concentrated and is 10 times the concentration you would thought, because the effect has been diluted by the big beam containing like dry areas, for instance. So there's a long way to go, and then there's a lot of in all these cases, there's a lot to be discovered, as Mike said. I like to point out that when I gave a talk at JPL a while ago about the peaks of eternal light, the highly illuminated regions on the poles, they said, well, why don't we just go there and do it and grab it? And I said, well, you may not want to do that. This is a kind of scramble for Africa idea. And in fact, the next year, it turned out there was a gigantic lava tube discovered that was several kilometers high and many kilometers wide, and the whole city of Philadelphia could fit inside it. And if we grabbed what we thought was the most valuable piece of real estate on the moon, we looked pretty silly when somebody else went and said, oh, thank you, we can appropriate places on the moon. Let's go to, this one's ours now. We've got this giant base for our own use. Thank you very much. So setting precedents is very dangerous. For us to work together now to get a set of rules about what you can do, because anyone could benefit, and nobody knows who's going to win yet. So there's plenty of.
So, Robin, you were introduced as a China specialist. We haven't talked very much about China, except in regard to transparency. How worried should we be about China? What should our perspective, our approach be?
I'm sorry to say, I am not a China specialist.
Misunderstood.
No, I was just pointing out that China would be an area of conflict. And she's our conflict specialist. But I do think it's a good question, and I would, even though none of us are China specialists, I mean, we all read about China. I would love to hear the panel's thoughts on how worried we should be.
I think we should be both concerned while at the same time pursuing potential opportunities for progress. Relative to the concerns, we cannot, as a nation, as a free world, afford to fall behind China in space-based robotics, in space exploration generally, and quantum. You know, these are all huge concerns. And again, I'm a Star Trek fan, so believe in the peace and optimistic future. At the same time, I think Russia's actions in Ukraine, strong reminder to all of us that, you know, our technological abilities are tied to our continued freedom. Talk about the importance of diversity and inclusivity, which I hold so dear, along with the other principles that make the United States, and the free world, the free world. You know, we fall behind autocratic states technologically at our peril. So that being said, I think there are also opportunities for potential collaboration. Space law and norms behavior being one of them. That in international NGOs such as the GEGS, Global Expert Group in Sustainable Lunar Activities, we've seen a great deal of common ground between Chinese policy and American policy. I also think on certain scientific pursuits, be they a lunar sample swap or climate change, where we're currently working with the Chinese in terms of at least gaining data from instruments that are in China. Those are areas that we can work together, again, with the caveat of not falling behind technologically due to a desire to preserve our freedoms for us in the free world. And I will say again, with the Accords, many of those principles directly relate to the kind of behavior that we would like to see from not just China, but other nations in terms of transparency, in terms of the full, free, and open release of scientific data, which would actually be in the Chinese own interests. I'm sure there's many in China that would prefer going that route. So I think by giving the world an example explicitly of what good looks like, via the Accords and activities such as COSPAR, we can hopefully influence China and others to do the right thing.
And although I'm not an expert on China, especially when it comes to capabilities and the moon, I can point to a couple cases of norms-related behaviors that China has exhibited recently that could maybe help to add to the bigger picture. First of all, China has an increasing stake in space, and if you care about space because you have the taikonauts on the Chinese space station, so they now have humans in space. That can increase your interest in preserving space and preserving those activities in the future. But we've also seen that this has led to the potential for disputes and misunderstandings when China sent a complaint to the UN saying that several Starlink satellites had approached too close to the station. And that kind of led to a diplomatic kerfuffle, say, of back and forth on who tried to contact who was ignoring whom, and what was too close and what happened. So that's a big example of things that not necessarily any signal of intent, but signal potential issues because China is caring more and more about the potential for these issues in space, how norms can help to resolve some of that. On the other hand, we have examples like the Long March 5B reentries, which we've already had 3 of those in the last couple of years, more to come. And I've spoken before on how the reentry of such a massive core stage, 10 stories tall, not all of which burns up in the atmosphere, and which is very difficult to predict. The Aerospace Corporation's Cord Center does their best, but if you've ever seen the maps, it is a grid of lines that slowly gets smaller, but at first it looks like it could fall anywhere. Really hard to mitigate or respond when you don't have that understanding. And so that's another example with better information sharing, with best practices in designing your systems so that perhaps that doesn't happen. These are all options and paths forward that is, from a normative perspective, will be very interesting to see where China goes as their stake and their perspective on space evolves in the coming decades.
And you see the White House reacting to this in, I think, a very positive and important fashion. So, for example, the White House led the ASAT testing prohibition on direct descent, ASAT, et cetera. That was in direct opposition to what China has done. On the flip side of that, White House OSTP led the ISAM strategy, the in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, which ensures that we stay ahead of China. So just two examples of how the White House, I think, is doing the right thing there, and applaud the Vice President's personal attention on the issue of space law and policy, which I think is fantastic.
Sure. I mean, getting back to China, as far as I remember and I've read, when we wanted to bring Russia into the ISS framework, we thought they're way too important and such a space power that we're going to need to renegotiate the entire ISS agreement, and it became US-Russia framework agreement for the ISS. I think something like that may be necessary for lunar activities, or at least coordination of lunar rules. I could not imagine China signing the Artemis Accords, but I can imagine, and also they may say, like, what is Artemis? That Artemis is like a Greek concept, a Greek god or something. I think that I would not be surprised, and I think it could work if something else specific to US and China on the moon and lunar behavior develops that they deserve.
And China has not said the Artemis Accords are wrong. They have never said anything overtly negative about the substance of the accords themselves. And certainly, even though they may not have a national law yet on space resources, they're certainly planning on using space resources themselves. So it's going to be really interesting to watch. I think also think about it geopolitically, what they're doing on Earth, as well, to sort of guide what they're doing in space. So
I think you're spot on, and certainly I don't want to speak for the Chinese, but I think there's a huge amount of commonality between what's in the Accords, and if at some point we see what China and Russia developed as to an answer to Artemis Accords, that's where the opportunity is, the common ground between the two documents.
Time for one more question.
Randy Gigante from the National Space Society. And I just want to highlight the Artemis Accords, and particularly how far we've come from the National Space Society's perspective in the recent past to help, as you've been talking about, implement the Outer Space Treaty. So the question I have is, since you've also, my goal, since you've also suggested that you have to keep coming to these presentations to interpret and to publicize what's already there in the Artemis Accords, when we go to Congress over the next few months as the National Space Society and the Alliance for Space Development, what should we be highlighting of the Artemis Accords for these new Congress people, as well as people that want to add to the law as to what to not do, or how to help improve what's already in the Artemis Accords? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the work of the NSS and support of the Artemis Accords, the Artemis program. Again, an example of one of the great NGOs that's so important for this entire ecosystem, as well as Michelle's. Relative to the Accords, I would emphasize first, there's no Accords without the Artemis program. So please, Congress, full funding of Artemis activities so that we actually have a need for the Accords, but also that the Accords are a beginning of a conversation, not an ending, and that there are norms of behavior that we should probably be trying to establish with coalitions of the willing, just like was done with the Accords, relative to national security. How close is too close? Do we have a good understanding of that? If there's going to be a conflict in space, let's at least have it be intentional versus some sort of misperception about one versus the other. The other concern is that we need to make sure that one country sign the Accords and express an interest in also joining the Artemis program, that there's robust follow-up. That the idea with the Accords, again, broadest, most diverse spaceflight coalition in history, that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for countries to join the IGA for the International Space Station. The Accords were a reaction to that, where no matter how robust your capabilities are as a nation, take like Japan, or how modest, take like a Bahrain, there's a place for you at the table. So I would urge Congress, urge NASA to engage as much as possible, even if it's just a couple of graduate students looking at lunar science. That's still an important contribution, so that we have the broadest coalition possible.
So I've been getting my my 2-minute warning. So I just want to take these last 2 minutes to thank the University of Arizona for giving us this opportunity to talk about the moon. And Tim, I just saw your name tag and put everything together. But and I think this is just, the start of the conversation. I think from the standpoint of the people in this room, what we can do. I mean, obviously the scientists are already working together, and perhaps we can build on the science that we have to create the more robust communication networks that we need to prevent the need for enforcement and actually just build communication. And so I do agree with my colleague from the NSS that the Artemis Accords are an incredible first step. I understand the issues that some nations have had with it, but I think it's an opportunity to continue the discussion, and I look forward to seeing what happens. The United Nations has stood up a working group on space resource utilization, and it will be really interesting to see what that group is able to produce over the next 5 years. So thank you to my panelists. It was as robust as I imagined it would be, and I really appreciate all of you coming and sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you for all the great discussion.